Welcome, I'm Claire Schaefer. Today, I will show you how to make this stunning shawl. This shawl was inspired by the ruffles on an Yves Saint Laurent evening gown. The original gown I saw was in a Rive Gauche shop. It had a tiered skirt with narrow ruffles at the waist and wide ones at the hem. As you see in this photograph, Yves Saint Laurent used the skewed ruffle just as a trim on the skirt. Saint Laurent also used ruffles on petticoats to provide volume for the skirt. The ruffle here is on the petticoat and hidden until the wearer sat down with her legs crossed. I first wrote about this shawl for my book High Fashion Sewing Secrets, which is now out of print. This shawl is perfect for any season and will add pizzazz to any wardrobe. It is a traditional triangle with a ruffle on two edges. The ruffle is offset or skewed and looks much fuller than it is. On this shawl, the ruffle is 2 inches wide, but it can be wider. Select a lightweight silk or a pretty synthetic for the shawl. These directions are for a 45-inch fabric. They can be adapted for a 60-inch lightweight wool. Examine the fabric. This is a chiffon Devaray or burnout fabric, which I found in my stash. A Devaray material is woven with 2 different fibers, then treated with a chemical to dissolve one of the fibers, leaving a semi-transparent pattern. When I pressed the fabric, I noticed a small white line. I wouldn't use the fabric for a garment, but the line will not be noticed on the shawl. I also noticed that the selvages were tight. Lay out the fabric. There are several ways to smooth away any wrinkles on a lightweight fabric like the chiffon. You can actually blow the wrinkles away. You can also use the back of your hand to smooth the fabric. This method works well on a variety of fabrics, and tailors often use it when spreading wools. For this shawl, cut 1 square 45 inches wide and 4 ruffle strips 45 inches wide and 5 inches long. My original pattern had 1/4 inch seam allowances. I used the narrow seam allowances for my sample, but decided that the shawl would be easier to sew if the seams were 1/2 inch wide. I pinned the fabric to tissue paper before cutting the ruffle strips. I used my stainless steel shears for cutting the chiffon because the fabric falls away from the blades easily. Mark the center on each side of the square with a small safety pin. For most of my sewing, I use a straight stitch foot because it holds the fabric more securely than the all-purpose zigzag foot. And for most stitching, I use a size 70/10 Microtex needle. This needle has a sharp point, and I prefer it for most fabrics. To prevent a thread knot at the beginning of a seam, stitch onto a fabric scrap before stitching onto the fabric. Sew the ruffle strips with right sides together. Place the ends of 2 strips close to the stitching scrap. Sew onto the fabric without cutting the threads. Continue to join the strips, placing the next seam close to the last one. Do not cut the threads until you finish. This is a ready-to-wear technique called chain stitching. I sometimes use small-sized needles instead of pins to hold the layers together. Finish the ends of the ruffles. Fold the strip lengthwise with right sides together and stitch the ends. Here is the stitched end. Press all the seams to one side. Turn the ruffle right side out. To create the skewed or offset ruffle, begin at one end and move the seam over 5/8 of an inch. Pin the long edges with wrong sides together. The ruffle will have a twist on the folded edge. I used a flower head pin because it is long and it is also smaller than many regular pins. At last, it is time to gather the ruffle. Fill the bobbin with a strong thread. I like a glazed cotton thread, silk buttonhole twist, or even fishing line. All of these are strong and slippery, so they are easy to pull up without breaking. If none of these are available, use regular polyester thread and divide the gathers into 4 sections so none are very long, and they will be less likely to break when you pull them up. Set the machine for a long stitch length and a light tension on the needle thread. This is the tension disc on my Singer Featherweight. If you are new to sewing or have forgotten which way to turn the tension disc, remember, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. Place the ruffle under the presser foot. My pin is between the layers at the fold. I used it to position the ruffle under the foot. Then I removed it before I began stitching. Stitch the gathers. I stitched only one row of gathers, but I think 2 would have been better. If you are using a stitching square, pull the square to the back so there is a little thread between the square and the ruffle. If you are not using a square, hold the thread securely when you begin stitching. Place a small safety pin at each seam on the ruffle. The seam is at an angle, so you can place it exactly on the seam or midway between the 2 angles. Pin and sew the ruffle to 2 adjacent edges of the shawl. The first seam on the ruffle matches a midpoint on the shawl. The second matches the corner, and the third matches a midpoint on the other side. I forgot to take a photo, so I copied the diagram in my book. Stitch the ruffle to the shawl. Notice that the gathered thread is centered under the foot, so you will stitch precisely on the gathering thread. Yes, this is one of the few times that you watch the needle when stitching instead of the edge of the foot. I used my shears to hold the ruffle flat in front of the foot. Here is another way to control the ruffle with your shears. And you can always use your index finger, which is readily available to control the ruffles. You can see how badly my fabric is fraying. This is a penalty you pay for using cheap fabric. Before finishing the shawl, carefully fold the ends of the ruffle out of the way so they will not be sewn into the seam. To finish the shawl, fold it right sides together to make a triangle. Match and pin the edges, then baste the edges together. On one side, mark a section 4 inches long with a short basting at each end. You actually could make the opening even smaller, but 4 inches is not difficult to close. Machine stitch the edges together, beginning with a couple of back stitches. Center the basting under the presser foot and stitch on the basted line. Stitch to the marked section and take a single back stitch. Do not stitch the marked section. At the second mark, take a single back stitch, continue stitching to the end, remove the bastings, and turn the shawl right side out. Carefully smooth the layers together at the opening, turn under the seam allowance, and baste the opening closed. Sew the opening permanently with a slip stitch or a ladder stitch. Pull the thread taut and secure the end. I used white thread so you could see my stitches. My stitches look a little wobbly, but I'm not concerned. It's going to look all right when it's finished. When I pulled the stitches taut, the opening was smooth and concealed. Looks pretty good, don't you think? Voila! The shawl is finished and ready to be enjoyed. Did you like this project? Would you like another? I'm Claire Schaefer. Thank you for joining me today. If you haven't already, please join my channel.